Inflation. We all hear about rising prices, but what's really going on behind the scenes? Well, it turns out inflation is way more than just extra money floating around. It's this whole ongoing process, a mix of money supply, shocks to our supply chains, and even just what we all expect to happen. Okay, first up, the main driver is something called demand pull. This is the classic story: too much money chasing too few goods. So when demand outstrips supply, prices jump. This usually happens when central banks pump a lot of cash and easy loans into the system. That link is absolutely critical. Second, the problem can also start on the supply side. We call this cost-push inflation. It's when the cost to make things goes up. Think raw materials. A prime example was the 70s energy crisis. A related shock is import prices. If your currency weakens, everything you import gets more expensive, and that can be nearly a third of what you buy. And finally, maybe the most powerful driver is just our expectations. If people think inflation is coming, they build it into contracts, like tying wages to the price index. So when the index rises, wages rise automatically, which pushes production costs up and creates a self-fulfilling spiral. By the way, the target for inflation is usually between 1% and 3%. So really, it's a constant tightrope walk, managing money, absorbing global shocks, and keeping public expectations stable, all to hit that target rate. This is the brief on the quantity theory of money and how to calculate inflation. So we're walking through a core macroeconomic exercise here. It uses the classic quantity theory of money to figure out how changes in the money supply and economic output actually affect the price level. First, you've got this foundational equation. M times V equals P times Y. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, M is the money supply, V is velocity, how often money changes hands, P is the overall price level, and Y is real economic output, GDP. It's basically saying money spent has to equal the value of stuff produced. Second, to make this useful, the theory often assumes that V, the velocity, is constant. That the speed at which money moves around doesn't really change much. And if V is constant, the math gets a lot simpler. The growth in the money supply then has to equal the growth in prices, that's inflation, plus the growth in economic output. Finally, let's just plug in the numbers. The source says the money supply grew by 5%, and real output grew by 2%. So using our simple formula, 5% equals inflation plus 2%. That means inflation has to be 3%. Simple as that. So the whole exercise shows that if velocity is stable, inflation is really the growth rate of the money supply minus the growth rate of the economy. This is the brief on the Fisher equation. It's the fundamental formula calculating whether your money is actually growing or just quietly disappearing by linking interest rates with inflation. First, let's look at the difference between what you see and what you actually get. The formula states your nominal rate equals the real rate plus expected inflation. The nominal rate is just that flashy number the bank advertises, but the real rate is your actual purchasing power gain. So to put that in perspective, if your bank offers a 5.6% rate but expected inflation is 3.2%, your real rate is only 2.4%. That 2.4% is the only growth that actually matters. Second, we enter the danger zone of negative real rates. If the nominal number is lower than inflation, your real rate goes negative, meaning you're losing wealth even while collecting interest. We saw a wild example of this in the US in 2021 and 2022. Inflation hit 9%, while Fed rates were near zero, around 0.25%. That created a real rate of roughly negative 8%, meaning anyone holding cash was rapidly losing their purchasing power. Finally, we have the central bank's lever. The Fed can't control inflation directly, so they manipulate nominal rates to make real rates either positive to cool the economy or negative to stimulate it. To sum it all up, the nominal rate is just a decoy sticker price, but the real rate, what remains after inflation, defines your true wealth. Always run the real rate math before you celebrate a high-interest offer.
70s stagflation crisis. High inflation, high unemployment, and low growth. But a 50-year-old theory perfectly explains why your money is losing value today. First, the root cause. Keynesian economics totally failed the 70s crisis because governments kept spending and central banks kept printing money. So Milton Friedman introduced a simple rule. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It isn't corporate greed. Prices rise simply because the money supply grows way too fast. Think of it like printing double the tickets for a concert with fixed seats. The ticket value just plummets. Second, the painful cure that actually works. In the 80s, leaders finally listened. Paul Volcker and Ronald Reagan aggressively raised interest rates to choke off the money supply. Similarly, Israel crushed its 1980s hyperinflation by slamming the brakes on spending. It meant short-term pain for sure, but massive long-term stability. So if this cure is proven, why are we dealing with inflation again after that massive COVID stimulus? Did we really just forget Friedman's lesson? Finally, the modern twist. We definitely forgot. But Friedman would actually love artificial intelligence. Why? Because AI drives productivity. Creating more output with the exact same amount of money absorbs excess cash without inflation. Think of AI as this giant economic sponge, expanding our capacity to literally soak up that leftover stimulus and stabilize prices. Because when it comes to rising prices, the real question isn't how we fight inflation, but whether we have the discipline to stop causing it in the first place.
You ever look at your grocery bill and wonder why it feels like a car payment lately? Well, you're not imagining things. And believe it or not, it's not just random bad luck. There's a specific logic behind why everything's getting more expensive. First, let's just nail down the core definition. Inflation really happens because of a classic formula. There's just way too much money chasing way too few goods. Second, all that extra money has to go somewhere, right? And that's where supply and demand kicks in. When you have a huge surge in demand for products, but a very limited supply, well, prices are going to jump to bridge that gap. It's inevitable. And finally, you gotta ask, where does all this extra money come from? A big driver is low interest rates, which make borrowing super cheap. When credit is easy to get, more people borrow and spend, and that floods the economy with cash. And central banks play a massive role in boosting that demand. So you see, inflation isn't just an accident. We all hear about rising prices, but what's really going on behind the scenes? A mix of money supply, shocks to our supply chains, and even just what we all expect to happen. Okay, first up, the main driver is something called demand pull. This is the classic story. Too much money chasing too few goods. So when demand outstrips supply, prices jump. This usually happens when central banks pump a lot of cash and easy loans into the system. That link is absolutely critical. Second, the problem can also start on the supply side. We call this cost-push inflation. It's when the cost to make things goes up. Think raw materials. A prime example was the 70s energy crisis. A related shock is import prices. If your currency weakens, everything you import gets more expensive, and that can be nearly a third of what you buy. And finally, maybe the most powerful driver is just our expectations. If people think inflation is coming, they build it into contracts.